March 15th, 1944. Aboard the USS Bunker Hill, Pacific Ocean. The air is thick with the smell of salt and fuel, surrounded by the relentless hum of machinery. Beneath the deck, in the dimly lit command center, Lieutenant Commander John Mitchell pores over complex maps scattered across a table, his brow furrowed in concentration. At 32, his once vibrant eyes now reflect the weight of countless tactical decisions. Outside, the sky is a violent canvas of dark clouds, foreboding the chaos of war. The sound of planes roaring overhead creates an almost deafening symphony of engines, punctuated by the distant boom of gunfire. The atmosphere is charged with tension. Something is amiss, but no one can quite put their finger on it. In the far corner, a young officer, Ensign Rick Thompson, nervously shifts from foot to foot, fidgeting with a clipboard. "Commander, the new bombing pattern. It doesn't seem right," he stammers, his voice barely audible over the din. But Mitchell, lost in thought, shakes his head, the weight of past failures clouding his judgment. What he didn't know was that this idea would change the war. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment below. The atmosphere is taut, charged with unspoken fears and the weight of responsibility. The fate of countless men and the outcome of the war hangs in the balance as Lieutenant Commander John Mitchell stares at the maps before him, pondering a challenge that feels insurmountable. The thin veneer of camaraderie among the officers barely conceals the anxiety that ripples through the command center like an electric shock. The United States Navy is embroiled in a brutal campaign against Japan, a conflict marked by relentless battles and significant loss. The Pacific Theater, a vast expanse of ocean dotted with islands, has become a theater of horrors, where the sun-scorched skies often give way to dark clouds of smoke rising from the remnants of once thriving towns. The bombing strategies employed by the American forces have shown themselves to be effective in certain instances, yet they remain inconsistent, fraught with errors that lead to civilian casualties and wasted resources. As Mitchell studies the maps, his mind whirls with the implications of their current strategies, the need for precision, critical, almost desperate. The Navy's tactics, heavily reliant on traditional bombing runs executed at high altitude, often result in imprecise strikes. In the haze of war, the commanders understand that something must change. As one senior officer grimly notes, "We're losing more than we're winning." The grim truth resonates throughout the room, hanging heavily in the air like a noxious fog. Statistics back up the dire sentiment. In the 6 months prior, naval air operations have reported a staggering 70% miss rate on strategic targets. Damage assessments reveal that while ships targeted for destruction barely sustain hits, civilian infrastructure is obliterated, leaving behind a trail of devastation and despair. The jarring contrast between military goals and humanitarian consequences weighs heavily on Mitchell and his fellow officers. The harsh reality becomes evident. Nothing worked, a report from the Naval Research Laboratory states, its words searing into Mitchell's consciousness. Our current methods are inefficient and dangerous. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, logistics complicate matters further. Bombs are heavy, and the aircraft that drop them are limited in their payload. The precision-guided munitions that might alleviate the problem are still years away from widespread deployment, trapped in the labyrinth of military bureaucracy and technological stagnation. The pressure mounts as military leaders grow increasingly frustrated with their inability to optimize bombing campaigns. They convene meetings filled with heated discussions, experts brought in to analyze and resolve the growing crisis. In one particularly heated gathering, a distinguished general throws down a folder filled with reports, a cascade of paper that flutters to the ground like fallen leaves. "We can't keep throwing men and machines into a strategy that fails. We need a new approach, or we're doomed to repeat our mistakes." As he speaks, the faces around the table harden, each officer silently acknowledging the weight of the truth in his words. The room is filled with an air of resignation, as if they've accepted their fate, bound to repeat the same flawed strategies. Yet, amidst this cacophony of despair, a sinister consensus rises. Experts agree it couldn't be done. The technological limitations and military protocols stand as immovable barriers to any innovative solution. The voices of caution drown out the whispers of innovation, leaving Mitchell feeling suffocated by the rigidity of their collective mindset. Outside, the storm mirrors the turmoil within the command center. The wind howls, and rain lashes against the hull of the USS Bunker Hill, creating an ominous soundtrack to their deliberations. The pilots, already inside their aircraft, are anxious for direction, wrestling with the uncertainty that plagues them. The lives of the men under his command and the fate of the mission depend on his willingness to fight for a new approach. The dawning realization that the tide of the war may hinge on one man's audacity begins to take root in his heart, igniting a fire that could potentially lead to redemption not only for himself, but for the countless souls caught in the maelstrom of war. In the heart of the Pacific, aboard the USS Bunker Hill, history hangs in the balance, awaiting the bold strokes of a commander willing to defy convention in pursuit of a greater good, a decision that could very well alter the course of the war itself. John Mitchell, 38, a wiry figure with a hawkish gaze, had spent the last decade navigating the tumultuous seas of the Pacific. Born in a small town in Massachusetts, he grew up with the rhythm of the ocean, dreaming of becoming a sailor. But life had thrust him into the chaos of war. The USS Bunker Hill, a formidable aircraft carrier, was his new home, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Seated at the cluttered command table, John's fingers ran over the maps scattered before him, the inked routes crisscrossing like veins on a leaf. His officers exchanged glances, some with conspiratorial smirks, others with fear. They were all acutely aware of the mounting casualty rates after each bombing mission. Each failed operation left behind a trail of destruction, not just in Japan, but in their hearts. We can't keep losing men like this, John thought, battling the burden of leadership pressing down on him. One evening, while the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, John found solace in the ship's library. Among stacks of dusty tomes, a particular book caught his eye. It was a historical account of aerial warfare, detailing strategies that had once turned the tide of battles. As he flipped through the pages, his heart raced. There it was, a simple observation about flight patterns, an idea so audacious it seemed almost ridiculous. What if we adjusted the bombing patterns? John whispered to himself, a spark igniting in his mind. Instead of the conventional approach, we could create a staggering effect. He envisioned a new strategy that would allow bombers to release their payloads in a staggered sequence, creating overlapping explosions that would maximize impact. It was a departure from the typical bombing run and could potentially confuse enemy defenses. Yet, doubt crept in. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, he thought, recalling the dismissive chuckles of his fellow officers. A sense of isolation descended upon him. As days turned into weeks, John wrestled with his idea. The weight of the war pressed down on him, each report of loss gnawing away at his conscience. He spent sleepless nights sketching diagrams, calculating the potential outcomes of his proposed method. The urgency of the situation was evident. Each hour wasted could cost lives. But authority loomed large. At the next command meeting, John's heart thudded painfully against his ribcage as he prepared to share his revolutionary idea. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady yet tinged with hesitation, "I believe we need to rethink our bombing strategy. I have an idea that can—" Enough of this nonsense, interrupted Captain Anderson, his brows furrowed. We've been through too many failures. We need proven tactics, not flights of fancy. Sir, this could be... Why don't you stick to what you know, Lieutenant Commander? Leave the innovating to the experts. Another officer chimed in, laughter reverberating through the room. The dismissal cut deeper than any wound. Feeling the heat of humiliation flush his cheeks, John retreated to his quarters, battling the demons of self-doubt. Maybe they're right, he thought, staring blankly at his reflection. What do I know about warfare? I'm just a cog in this machine. Yet, as he closed his eyes, the image of his fellow sailors, brave men sacrificing everything, flashed before him. Driven by a desperate urge to protect them, John decided he couldn't abandon his idea. He sought out Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, a brilliant engineer and munitions expert renowned for her unconventional thinking. "Sarah," he said, urgency lacing his voice, "I need your help." "What's this about, John?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "I have a strategy for bomb deployment. I believe we can increase our effectiveness by staggering the release. It could minimize our losses and maximize damage on target." She studied him for a moment, her lips pursed in thought. "You're suggesting that we defy standard military protocol. What makes you think it will work?" "Because the enemy won't expect it. It could confuse their defenses, create chaos. We can't keep losing men. We have to try." Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes narrowing in contemplation. "All right, I'm in. But we'll need to test this in secret. If we fail, we can't let anyone know." A wave of relief washed over John. Together, they enlisted the help of a few trusted crew members. Under the cover of night, they set up a makeshift testing area on the flight deck, using old munitions and a series of calculated drop tests. The first attempts were disastrous. Bombs detonated prematurely or fell far from their intended marks, leaving John and Sarah despondent. "We're wasting time," John muttered one night, frustration boiling over. "What if this is just a pipe dream?" But Sarah remained steadfast. "Every great innovation has its failures, John. We just need to refine it." With renewed determination, they adjusted their calculations, tweaking the angles and timing. The next test felt electric with anticipation. As the bombs released in staggered succession, a collective breath was held among them. A thunderous roar filled the night, and the explosions rippled through the air like a heartbeat, synchronized and powerful. John's heart raced, elation surging as he watched the new pattern unfold. "It worked!" he exclaimed, disbelief making way for triumph. In that moment, John realized that sometimes hope is born from the most improbable ideas. As he and Sarah exchanged gleeful glances, he felt a flicker of faith rekindled within him. If you're hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button. As dawn broke over the horizon, the sky illuminated in soft pastels. John knew that the journey ahead was fraught with challenges, but for the first time he held a glimmer of optimism. He might not yet have the approval of his superiors, but he had a vision, and it was time to act. June 12, 1945. The sweltering heat of the Pacific hung heavy in the air aboard the USS Bunker Hill. The ship rocked gently on the waves, but the tension in the command center was palpable. John Mitchell stood at the helm, sweat beading on his forehead as he reviewed the hastily drawn diagrams and scribbled notes that had become his life's work. His mind raced with the possibilities of his recently conceived bombing pattern, one he believed could turn the tide of the war by maximizing destruction while minimizing friendly casualties. "Are you sure about this, Mitchell?" Commander James O'Reilly, a burly man with a skeptical frown, leaned over the table, his voice booming against the low hum of the engines. "What you're proposing goes against every protocol we have." "It's a new approach, Commander," John replied. his voice steadier than he felt. We need to adapt. The current bombing strategies are outdated. We can streamline our attacks, focus on the most critical targets. O'Reilly crossed his arms, his brows furrowed in doubt. You're suggesting we alter the entire bombing formation based on an untested theory. If it fails, lives could be lost. John's heart raced. He understood the risks, but he had seen too many failed missions due to rigid adherence to old tactics. With all due respect, sir, it's not just a theory, it's a calculated risk. We have data from previous raids. I've analyzed it. We can reduce collateral damage significantly while increasing our hit rate on enemy installations. Data that you generated from a hunch, O'Reilly scoffed. That's not enough to convince me. Desperation gnawed at John. He needed an ally, someone who could see the potential in his idea. As the commander turned away, dismissing him, John spotted a figure lingering in the doorway. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson, a young engineer with a reputation for innovative thinking. Lieutenant Thompson, John called, his mind racing. Do you have a moment? Sarah stepped into the room, her expression curious yet cautious. What's going on, Commander Mitchell? John, he corrected, the urgency in his tone cutting through the formalities. I need your expertise. I'm proposing a new bombing pattern, but O'Reilly isn't convinced. She cocked her head, intrigued. What's the basis? Look here. John spread the maps across the table, tracing the lines with his finger. By restructuring the formation, we can create a denser impact area with fewer planes. It's about precision, not just power. Sarah leaned in, her green eyes sparkling with interest as she scanned the data. This could work, but we need to test it before presenting it again to the brass. John nodded, a surge of hope rising within him. Exactly. We conduct a clandestine test, just a small squadron to minimize risk and observe the results. If we can show them it works, they might come around. Sarah bit her lip, considering the implications. And if it fails, we could be court-martialed for going behind orders. Then we'll just have to make sure it doesn't fail, John replied, a fierce determination in his voice. Under the cover of night, June 25, 1945. The USS Bunker Hill was a ghost ship, its usual clamor muted under the cloak of darkness. A select group of pilots, hand-picked by John and Sarah, gathered in the hangar bay. Each wore a look of anxious anticipation mixed with excitement. Listen up, John addressed the pilots, his heart pounding in his chest. Tonight, we're going to test a new bombing pattern that could save lives and turn the war in our favor. This is a chance to make history, but it's also a risk. Trust the plan, and we'll get through this. Let's show them what we can do, one pilot shouted, earning murmurs of agreement from the others. John smiled, heartened by their enthusiasm. The planes roared to life, slicing through the night sky as they ascended from the carrier. John's pulse quickened, the rhythmic thrum of the engines echoing in his ears. He glanced at Sarah, who was seated beside him in the command center. Her eyes were glued to the radar screen, fingers twitching with anticipation. Let's do this, he said, steeling himself as they approached the designated target area. He could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him. As the squadron descended, the pilots followed John's carefully plotted formation. The air grew tense with expectation. John focused, issuing commands with a calm urgency. Drop the payload. The bombs fell in a precise pattern, creating a devastating impact that lit up the night sky. The explosions were more controlled than anything John had witnessed before. Miraculously, they had achieved a level of coordination he had only dreamed of. Hit! We did it! Sarah exclaimed, her voice a mixture of disbelief and joy. The data streamed in, confirming their success. Targets destroyed, minimal collateral damage. John exhaled, relief flooding over him. We have to get this data back to command. They need to see what we accomplished tonight. Days later, July 2nd, 1945. The atmosphere in the command center buzzed with anxiety and anticipation as John and Sarah prepared to present their findings to Commander O'Reilly and the higher-ups. The room was filled with officers, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Commander O'Reilly," John began, his heart racing. "We conducted a secret test. Here are the results." He handed over the meticulously documented data, highlighting the successful bombing pattern. The room fell silent as the officers reviewed the findings. O'Reilly's brow furrowed, his expression shifting from skepticism to contemplation. This is impressive." John seized the moment. "Imagine what we could achieve if we implemented this on a larger scale. We could save lives and increase our effectiveness in future operations." The tension in the room reached a crescendo. O'Reilly looked around at his fellow officers, their expressions wavering between doubt and intrigue. "And you're certain this approach is replicable?" "Absolutely. We've already proven it in a real-world scenario," John stated, his conviction unwavering despite the weight of the moment. After a beat that felt like an eternity, O'Reilly nodded slowly. "Very well. We'll authorize a full-scale test in the field. Prepare the squadron." As the orders were given, John felt a surge of adrenaline and relief. They had crossed a threshold, transforming a risky idea into a sanctioned operation. It was a victory, but the real test awaited. If you're hooked on this story, hit that subscribe button, John thought, as he prepared for the next phase of their journey, a sense of hope igniting within him. Little did they know, the impact of their innovation would ripple across the Pacific, changing the course of air warfare forever. May 14th, 1945. The USS Bunker Hill, stationed in the Pacific, rocked gently on the waves, yet tension hung thick in the air, as palpable as the salt spray. Inside the command room, the atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation and skepticism. Officers gathered around a long oak table, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single overhead bulb, which cast shadows that danced like specters of doubt. John Mitchell stood at the head of the table, his posture resolute, but his heart raced. He gripped a stack of reports in white-knuckled hands, the pages crinkling under pressure. The murmurs of disbelief echoed around him, and he swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their collective scrutiny. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but urgent, "I believe I have found a way to increase our bombing accuracy significantly." Lieutenant Commander Harris, a stout man with a bristle of gray hair, leaned forward, skepticism etched into his brow. "Mitchell," he interrupted, "with all due respect, your theory based on a typing error," he scoffed, "is hardly a basis for operational change." The room erupted in whispers, incredulous glances exchanged like currency. "It's not just a typing error," John insisted, his voice rising over the clamor. "It's an insight. Changing coordinates can improve our targeting by up to 50%. We can reduce collateral damage and save lives, American lives." Commander Baxter, a hawkish figure with a reputation for hardline decisions, narrowed his eyes. "And you propose we test this in the field? You realize what's at stake, don't you? Lives are on the line." John swallowed again, feeling the gravity of his position. He glanced at the maps spread across the table, the inked paths of destruction they represented. "I understand," he replied, his voice firm. "But if we don't try, we risk losing even more. We owe it to our men out there." "Experts have agreed it couldn't be done," Harris interjected, crossing his arms defensively. "What makes you think you're any different?" John's heart thudded in his chest, memories of his years of service flooding his mind. The lives lost, the cries for help that echoed in his dreams. "Because I've seen it work," he said, the words tumbling out with conviction. "In simulations, it showed promise. We need to give it a chance." Baxter leaned back in his chair, assessing the room, his expression unreadable. A long silence stretched, punctuated only by the creaking of the ship and the distant sound of waves. The officers exchanged looks, the weight of John's proposal hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Baxter sighed, rubbing his temples. "Fine. We'll give you 3 days to prove your theory. One test. If it fails, it's on you." John felt a rush of relief and excitement. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." A nod of acknowledgement passed through him as he collected his papers, feeling the gravity of the opportunity he had just been given. Outside, the sun began to set, casting a fiery glow over the horizon. The ship's crew moved about their duties, unaware of the monumental task ahead. Over the following days, John assembled a small team of engineers and pilots, each chosen for their unwavering belief in his vision. Together, they worked tirelessly, recalibrating the bomb sites and running simulations late into the night. The sound of clattering keyboards and hushed conversations filled the room. A fragile hope began to take shape. "Do you really think this will work?" One engineer, a young man named Carter, asked, glancing nervously at John. "We have to believe it will," John replied, the determination in his voice unwavering. "This is our chance to make a difference." As the day of the test approached, nerves ran high. John stood on the flight deck, watching the planes prepare for takeoff. The roar of engines echoed like a battle cry, and he felt the adrenaline surge through him. It was more than just a test. It was a lifeline. The moment arrived, and the crew gathered around the observation area, their faces a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. As the first plane took off, John's heart raced. He watched as the aircraft climbed higher, the world below shrinking into insignificance. "Okay, Mitchell." Baxter's voice pierced through the tension. "Let's see what you've got." The crew below held their breath, eyes glued to the sky as the plane approached the simulated target zone. John's fingers drummed against the railing, a rhythm of hope and fear. The bomb was released, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still. Then the explosion lit up the horizon, a brilliant fireball followed by a shockwave that rattled their bones. John squinted against the brightness, his pulse pounding in his ears. When the smoke cleared, a collective gasp swept through the observers. The target had been hit dead center. "It worked!" someone shouted, disbelief morphing into jubilant cheers. John felt a surge of triumph wash over him, a release of the months of tension and self-doubt. Baxter clapped John on the shoulder, a grudging smile breaking through his stern demeanor. "You just might have changed the course of this war, Mitchell." "Let's not celebrate yet," John replied, still catching his breath. "This is just the beginning." In the days that followed, further tests confirmed what they had hoped. Accuracy rates soared, and reports of collateral damage began to dwindle. The success of the new bombing pattern reverberated through the military command, shifting the tide of opinion. But with recognition came scrutiny. John found himself in another command meeting weeks later, with the atmosphere vastly different. Officers who had once scoffed now leaned in, eager to hear his insights. "We need to implement this across all fronts," Harris said, his voice tinged with urgency. "It's crucial for our operations moving forward." As they discussed the ramifications of the new strategy, John absorbed the moment. He had gone from the margins to the center stage, though the journey was still far from over. He felt the weight of responsibility resting on him, the lives they could save now firmly entwined with his fate. "Remember," Baxter cautioned, "this is a game changer. We must execute flawlessly. The pressure will be on. Yes, sir, John replied, a newfound resolve coursing through him. We'll ensure it's done right. As the meeting adjourned, John stepped out into the bright Pacific sunlight, the warmth offering a stark contrast to the cool shadows of the command room. He breathed in deeply, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The thrill of victory was sweet, but the cost of war lingered at the edges of his consciousness. This was more than just a tactical victory. It was a step toward humanity amidst chaos. He knew the battle for hearts and minds was ongoing, and he was ready to lead that charge. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, an omen of hope. John Mitchell was no longer just a sailor. He was a beacon for change, a man on a mission to turn the tides of war, one bombing run at a time. May 10th, 1945. The air in the cramped conference room aboard the USS Bunker Hill is thick with tension. The faint hum of the ship's engines is a distant reminder of the chaos outside. Bright overhead lights flicker intermittently, casting harsh shadows on the faces of naval officers and analysts gathered around the table. John Mitchell stands at the front, a map spread before him, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusts his glasses. Members of the command, I stand before you to present a method that could potentially change the very fabric of our aerial combat tactics, he declares, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The officers look skeptical, some exchanging doubtful glances. Admiral Teague, a robust man with graying hair and a stern demeanor, leans back in his chair, arms crossed. Mitchell, we've seen countless proposals before. What makes yours different? He challenges, his voice dripping with skepticism. John swallows hard, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. This isn't just a theory. It's based on the data we collected from the last missions. The bombing patterns we've employed have been inefficient, leading to unnecessary losses.